We probably have two more lessons this week and next week in the book of Job before we go into our study of Ecclesiastes. And so just reviewing very quickly what we have gone through every week, the book of Job easily divides itself into three sections. You have the prologue in chapter 1 and chapter 2 that sets the stage for all that follows. We are introduced to Job. What kind of man was Job? He's a blameless and an upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil. He was very prosperous. He had 10 children. He was the wealthiest of all the men of Uz. And in one day, what did he lose? He lost everything. He lost his children. He lost all of his wealth. And in all of that, Job did not curse God. In fact, he told his wife, naked came I from my mother's womb, naked go I hence. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Then there's the second round of trials that come in chapter 2. Satan comes to God and said, well, of course, Job is still serving you because you protected him. Attack him personally, talking about his health, and he'll curse you to the face. And so Satan is given permission by God to attack Job only with the condition that he cannot take his life. And so Job is afflicted, and again he rebukes his wife when she says, why don't you just curse God and die? At the end of chapter 2, 3 friends show up, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and for 7 days they sat silently with Job during this trial. Then beginning in chapter 3, we have the cycle of speech, what we call the dialogue. And Job began by saying, I wished I had never even seen the light of day. I wish I'd never been born. But in that I was born, I wish that I had been stillborn. And in that I wasn't stillborn, I wished I could die now. And the friends respond to Job. And sum up just very quickly, what is the friend's message to Job? Bad things don't happen what? To good people. So if you're suffering, you must have sinned, and what you need to do is you need to repent of that sin. And it goes back and forth between the friends and between Job. Job saying, God's using me as target practice. I don't understand why I'm going through all of this. Job acknowledges sometimes people that are suffering say things they don't really mean in the midst of suffering. And he tells his friends, you're pretty lousy at this comforting business. In fact, you haven't helped me at all. As it got toward the end, the heat of those conversations sort of escalated with the friends making some accusations against Job. They can't prove anything, but Job, it seems you were wealthy, and in that you were wealthy and God took it away, it must mean that maybe you were dishonest in how you gained your wealth. Maybe you've taken advantage of the poor. Maybe you haven't helped people out in the time of trouble. And so that goes back and forth. Who's right in that conversation, Job or his friends? The answer is neither are correct. Is there a grain of truth in what all of them say? Yes, I think the friends are good men. They hold the biblical principles, but they misapply those principles to the case. For example, we've said, does man reap what he sows? Yes. Does that always play out here on earth? Not always. And so their application to the case of Job is incorrect. Then Elihu shows up. And Elihu we were introduced to in chapter 32. And Elihu is the younger man that has observed all of this. And Elihu says, okay, I've been holding back because I'm younger. And I thought maybe eventually you were going to say something wise, talking to the 3 friends. But the more I've listened, the more I've come to the conclusion that old people don't always have wisdom. Those that are older don't always have wisdom, and you haven't shown any. You haven't convinced Job. You haven't provided any evidence. I'm about to explode, and now I've got to speak. And in chapter 32 and through 33, he has condemned first the friends in verses 6 through 22, and then he turned to Job in chapter 33. He said, listen to me, your complaint against God is not right. He talked about how God communicates with man, and then he said, Job, if you can answer me, do it. But if not, be quiet. Apparently, as Job is quiet, doesn't immediately respond, Elihu begins to speak again in chapter 34, and that brings us to where we are. And in chapter 34, if you had to sum up what Elihu is saying, he's saying that God is just. Job, you've accused God of being unfair, but God is a just God. Hear my words, you wise men. I think that's sarcasm on the part of Elihu directed toward the three friends in Job. Give ear to what I have and test it. Look at verse 5. Job has said, I am righteous, but God has taken away my justice. In essence, what Elihu says is, Job, you're saying you're right, and God is what? God's wrong. God's taken away my justice. Should I lie concerning my right? My wound is incurable, though I am without transgression. Interestingly, that word that is translated wound in verse 6 is the word that is typically translated as arrow throughout the Scripture, or archer. If you did a quick search in your electronic device this morning, you'd see that, with the exception here, I believe, of Job 6, but in the vast majority of cases, it is translated as an arrow. What did Job accuse God of doing? You remember? He's using me for what? Target practice. Job chapter 6, he had made that point with regard to God, that he was using him as target practice. Job 6 in verse 4. So Elihu seems to be picking up on that, and he's saying, Job, you're saying you're right, you haven't done anything, and in doing so, you're accusing God. In fact, you're drinking up scorn like water in verse 7, and you're saying it profits man nothing that he should delight in God. Job, you're saying you don't think there's any value at all in serving the Lord. Let me ask you, is he correctly representing what Job has said? Has Job really said that? Not really. Do you understand why Elihu could take Job that way? Yeah. Go back over to Job 9. In fact, Job 19, Job had pointed out that, I'm going to serve God. I know my Redeemer lives. He'll stand on earth at last. But go over to Job 9, if you will, and verses 22 and 23. Here's one of the statements Job had made. It is all one thing. Therefore, he says, he destroys the blameless and the wicked. If the scourge slays suddenly, he laughs at the plight of the innocent. The earth is given into the hand of the wicked. He covers the faces of its judges. If it is not he, who else could it be? Could you understand why Elihu could take some of the statements that Job has made and say, Job seems to be saying what? It didn't really matter whether you serve God or not. It doesn't profit anything, because here, look at me and what I'm going through. And so Job, he says, really in verses 1 to verse 9, you're just like the wicked men in verse 8. You're company with the workers of iniquity. You walk with wicked men, and the reason you walk with wicked men is you're pointing the finger of blame at God, and you're saying God's not just, but God is just. He cannot do wickedly. In fact, Elihu really in 34 through 37 is coming to God's defense. Not everything he says is perfectly accurate. He's sort of closer than anybody that spoke thus far. But he's saying God can't do wrong. God can't do wickedness. Everything God does is right. In fact, listen to what he says. He repays men according to his work and makes man to find reward according to his way. Is that true? Yeah, it is true. Does God eventually, in fact, what was the lesson last Sunday morning? We reap what we sow, okay? Is that a true biblical principle? Well, Paul said it in Galatians chapter 6. You sow to the wind. The book of Hosea says you reap the whirlwind. And so man sows according to what he reaps, at least eventually he does that. Not only does he treat man according to how man lives, God is subject to no one in verse 13. Who gave him charge over the earth, or who appointed him over the whole world? What's the implied answer to that? Nobody did. You ever heard somebody say to somebody, who left you in charge? Well, who could say that to God? Who left God in charge? Nobody. Why? He's sovereign. He's God. And that's the point that Elihu is making. Nobody put God in charge. Nobody gave him charge over the earth. He's God. He's the one that exercises all power. And if God's the one that's sovereign, then God must be just. If God wanted to, what could God do with man? 14 and 15. If he set his heart on it, he could destroy all of mankind. He's got that kind of power. All flesh would perish together, and the dust would return and the flesh would return to the dust. If God wanted to, he could wipe out everybody. But God's not going to do that. Why? Because God is He's just and He's kind and He's loving. Verse 16, if you understand this, or if you have understanding, hear this. Listen to the sound of my words. Should one who hates justice govern? Will you condemn him who is most just? The argument seems to be, what kind of person do we want governing? Just person. Now, that's not to say that everybody that governs is always just, but if one is putting one in charge, that's how one should govern, is with justice. And if God is going to govern the world, is it not stand to reason that He governs it by principles of justice? That's the point. He's impartial in 18 to 20. Verse 18 to 20, is it fitting to say to a king, you are worthless, and to nobles, you are wicked? In other words, you and I, if we lived in a monarch, if this was a monarch and we had a king, Kyle wouldn't go up to the king and said, you just a worthless king. Why? He could lose his life. So typically the people in power like that, are they treated differently? Sure they are. Because we realize the power they have. But what about God? Does God treat them differently? No. And that's the point. We wouldn't say to the king, you're worthless, but yet, look at verse 19, yet he is not partial to princes, nor does he regard the rich more than the poor, for they are all the work in his hand. In a moment they die, in the middle of the night, the people are shaken and pass away. The mighty are taken away without hand. Here's the point. God is just, and one reason God is just, He's perfectly impartial. He doesn't care who you are. He doesn't care where you are on the power scale. He doesn't care how much money you have. God treats everybody what? The same. Romans 2 and verse 11, there's no partiality with God. Peter said in Acts 10, 34 and 35, after having seen that vision during the days of Cornelius, that in truth I perceive that God shows what? No partiality, but in every nation who fears Him and works righteousness is accepted of Him. God is just because God knows everything. His eyes are on the ways of man, and He sees all his steps. What does God know about you? Everything. You remember in the New Testament, He said, even the very hairs on your head, what? Are numbered. Something that's insignificant, something you don't even know. God knows everything about man. He knows everything we do. He knows everything that we think. What does that mean about His just? Well, He's just because He has all the information. He has all of the facts. Verse 23, He need not consider a man that he should go before God in just judgment. It's typically explained that verse 23 probably means this. God knows us perfectly well that He doesn't have to do any investigation. Let me illustrate this way. Let's say somebody had a business. Let's say Ben wants to hire somebody, and they may come in, they put a resume down, and then he may call, because he doesn't know everything about him, right? So he may call this employee over here that they used to work with and ask about him. He may have to do some investigation into them. Does God have to investigate and consider? No, why? He already knows it all. He knows everything. So He doesn't have to investigate into the matter. So God is just, Elihu was saying. He repays according to His word, except to no one. He could destroy man. He governs with justice, impartially sees the steps of man, and He punishes the wicked in 24 to 28. Job has implied at least that temporarily the wicked seem to get the same treatment what? Sometimes the righteous do. By the way, just as a side, is that sometimes true on earth? We're going to get in the book of Ecclesiastes. One of the things that frustrated Solomon is Solomon says sometimes it happens to the righteous according to the wicked and the wicked according to the righteous. So sometimes it seems on earth, sometimes it is true that it seems like the wicked are doing better. But we're talking in the big picture of things here. Ultimately, the wicked is going to be punished. Look at verse 24. He breaks the mighty men without inquiry and sets others in their place. He can raise kings up and take them down. He knows their work. Look at the words he uses in 25 through 29. He overthrows, he crushes, he strikes them. He causes them, those that cause the poor to cry, He's going to seek justice with them. And so the point is, God's fair, and God's fair in that eventually the wicked are going to be punished. And nobody really has a right to condemn God for how He rules in the kingdoms of men. When He gives quietness, who then can make trouble? And when He hides His face, who then can see Him, whether it is against a nation or man alone, that the hypocrite should not reign, lest the people be ensnared? In other words, when God decides something, who can object to that? Who can change that? The answer is no one can. Now, if you remember in 31 to 37 here, the response to chastening, if you remember back at the end of chapter 33, Elihu had made this point that God, he talked about two ways God speaks to man or communicates to man. One, and this is in 14 to 30 of chapter 33, was through dreams and visions. The other in 19 to 30 was that sometimes he chastens man through suffering. Now, sometimes God, through suffering, sends a message to mankind in order to chasten him. Is that true? Yes. Is it true that all suffering is the chastening of God? No. The problem with Elihu as well as Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar is sometimes they get get too far on God's end and they start speaking where they don't have knowledge about things. Okay, but this idea that sometimes suffering is designed to chasten us is an undeniable fact. So what Elihu comes back to in 31 through 37 is the response to chastening. Those subpoints should be brought over there on that outline. But he said, as anyone said, I have borne chastening, I will offend no one. Teach me, what do I see? If I have done iniquity, I will do no more. Should he repay it according to your terms just because you disavow it? You must choose and not I. Therefore speak what I know. Here's the point in 31 to 33. When man faces suffering as a form of chastening, how should he respond to that? In verse 32. He should submit to God. In other words, he said, okay, I've been doing wrong, what? I'm going to quit that. I've learned, I'm going to quit that wrong that's the effect that it should have on mankind. It should cause him to modify his conduct. Now, Elihu hasn't come straight out like the other friends have and said, Job, what? You're a sinner. Is he sort of implying that, though? He's sort of making some implication that God's chasing you, and if you responded the right way, you'd leave iniquity behind. The implication is what? You're guilty of some iniquity of some sort. So in that sense, he's not a lot different than the friends. And Job, you ever had somebody tell you something, and then in order to defend what they're saying, listen, everybody agrees with me. And that's what Elihu sort of says at the end when he says, Job, men of understanding say to me, wise men who listen to me, Job speaks without knowledge and his words are without wisdom. Job, I'm not alone in this opinion. Everybody I've talked to that's got any wisdom at all, what? They see things the way that I see things. And they all agree that you're speaking without knowledge and without wisdom. Oh, that Job were tried to the utmost, because his answers are like those of wicked men, and he adds rebellion to his sin. Everybody agrees, Job, you're guilty of sin for questioning God. If that's not enough, now you're adding rebellion to that. And anybody with any sense sees things the way that I see things. So, 34, is it a good speech? Well, 10 to 30 is pretty good when he talks about God, until he gets off talking to Job about needing to repent and accusing Job of rebellion. Now, 35, he deals with this question: is there any profit in living a good life? Is there any reason to live a good life? And he begins by charging Job with saying that he's more righteous than God. And in verse 3, what advantage will it be to you, and what profit shall I have more than if I have sinned? So really two charges about Job. Job, you said you're more righteous than God is. Had Job said that? No, he had not said that. And number two, Job, you're saying that it didn't matter whether you sinned or not. There's really not any value to doing what is good. Job really hadn't said that either. But in 4 through verse 8, he makes this point to Job. Men are affected by the conduct of others. God isn't. And he said, I'm going to answer you and your companions. Look to the heavens and see, and behold the clouds which are higher than you. If you sin, what do you accomplish against him? And if your transgressions are multiplied, what do you do to him? Here's the point. The point is not that God doesn't care about our sin. It's not in the sense that God's not affected by it, in the sense that God could care less whether we sin or not. The Bible, he cared enough and was affected by it enough, he sent what? His son to die for us. The Bible talks about how sin grieves the Lord. But the point is in terms of robbing God of something that he needs, what? My actions don't affect the Lord in that sense. He's not worshiped with men's hands as though what? He needs anything. So my sins might affect you, and I might take something from you, but sin in that sense doesn't have an effect upon the Lord. If you're righteous, what do you give him, and what does he receive from your hand? In other words, what is God getting from you when you offer anything to him, including your service, that God really just what? Has to have. You know, he can't live without it. He's dependent on it. And the point is, God's not dependent what? On you. You're acting as if God needs something from you. He doesn't need anything from you. Your wickedness affects a man such as you, and your righteousness, he said, a son of man. Job, you've been complaining that God's not answering you. You know, how many times have Job has said, you know, I wish I could go to God and present my case and God would answer me, but there's nobody to be a go-between between me and God. Or here I have pled with God and he's not answering. Well, Elihu says, I've got a reason for that, Job. And the reason God's not answering you is because your talk is empty. It's not that God can't answer, but God's not going to answer. I think Barnes is right. It's your attitude, Job. I think he's right in terms of what Elihu means here. Not that that's the reason God had not responded yet. But really what he's saying is, in essence, Elihu's saying, Job, you've got a bad attitude, and it's your attitude that's keeping God from responding to you. Let's see if we can work our way through this. Because of the multitude of oppressions they cry out for help because of the arm of the mighty. But no one says, where God is my maker, who gives songs in the night, who teaches us more than the beasts of the earth and makes us wiser than the birds of heaven. There they cry out, but he does not answer because of the pride of evil men. In other words, the implication is God would answer, but there's something that's keeping God, and the problem is, Job, you're arrogant. In your arrogance, you won't listen to God, and so God's not going to respond to you because you wouldn't listen to him if he did. He goes ahead and says, surely God will not listen to empty talk, nor will the Lord Almighty regard it. You ever been in a situation where somebody's saying a whole lot of things and your response is, you know what, I'm not even going to answer it. You know, that it's so empty and so vain that you think, you know what, it's not even worth responding to. I think that's in essence what Elihu is saying. Job, your talk is so empty that God has just said what? I'm not even going to respond to that. And that's the reason God is not responding to you. Although you say you do not see him, yet justice is before him, and you must wait for him. If there's really one great piece of wisdom in Elihu's speeches, outside his defense of God, it is he's saying to Job, Job, this is what you've got to do. You've got to learn to wait. What does that imply? Patience, what we remember with Job. Job, just wait. Endure. God, be patient with the Lord. He'll answer and respond in the right time. And now, because he's not punished in his anger, nor taken much notice of folly, therefore Job opens his mouth in vain and multiplies his words without knowledge. Job, you don't know what you're talking about, and you just keep talking and talking and talking, and you don't know what you're saying. And so, chapter 35... he's really taking issue with what Job has said. He doesn't correctly represent everything that Job says, but he comes back and he tells Job, you're really just a fool and you don't know what you're talking about. Now in 36 and 37, where we're going to spend the rest of our time here this morning, is Elihu's defense of God. Where in Elihu's mind, and he's not wrong, both the friends and Job have impugned to some degree the character of God in what they've said. And Elihu says, since nobody else is going to defend the Lord, I'm going to come to defend him. And in many ways, what Elihu says is very similar to what we'll talk about next week that God says in talking to Job in 38 through chapter 40 and in verse 2. He begins by saying, bear with me because I speak the truth. I will say this about Elihu. He's a young man, and I think he's probably, though some argue with this, commentators argue with this, Elihu at least borders on the arrogant side. Okay, some say that's reading too much into it, but can you imagine, for example, if I got up to preach one Sunday and my introduction, I said, y'all listen to me, I know what I'm talking about. You know, there's one person here that's got knowledge. That's me. Listen to what I have to say. And eyes would start to roll, and people wonder, what arrogance? Well, listen to what he says here. Bear with me a little. I speak on God's behalf. I'm going to speak for God. I'm speaking on his behalf. I will fetch my knowledge from afar, and I will ascribe righteousness to my Maker. Truly, my words are not false, and one who is perfect in knowledge is with you. Now, in verse 4, some of that, commentators have taken that differently. Some believe in verse 4, when he said, one who is perfect in knowledge is with you, that's a reference to God. I'm not convinced of that. I'm not convinced, but that Elihu's not saying, listen to me, I know what I'm talking about. Y'all all have acted the fool, and now one that knows what he's talking about, what? He's about to speak, so open up your ears. So for a young man speaking to these older men, it's a little bit what? It's arrogant, brash on his part. But his defense of God is good. Beginning at verse 5, he said, God's mighty and despises no one. Behold, God is mighty, but he despises no one. He's mighty in strength and understanding. What kind of power does God have? He's got all power. And yet, in spite of the fact that God has all power and all might and is the Almighty, who does he despise? The answer here that he gives is what? None any. I'm not talking about whether or not God disapproves of the wicked, but I reminded the psalmist, and is it in Psalm 8 that the psalmist said, what is man that you're mindful of him, and the son of man that thou considerest him? Yes, God is mighty. A lot of times when you're dealing with the mighty, they may look down their nose at others, right? I mean, you get somebody in a position of power, whether it's a king or a politician, and sometimes you've seen politicians that, they started out sort of low and they work themselves up, and then they get to the top and what? Now they look down their nose and they despise others. I think here's the point. God is the mighty God. He's all powerful, and yet what? Does he look down and despise others? No, he doesn't do that. Look at verse 6. He does not preserve the life of the wicked and gives justice to the oppressed. He does not withdraw his eyes from the righteous, but they are on the throne with kings, for he has seated them forever and they are exalted. Does God preserve the wicked? No. Does he withdraw his eyes from the righteous? No. Is Elihu correct in that? He is. The eyes of the Lord are what? Are on who? The righteous. And his ears are open to their prayers, but the face of the Lord is against those that do evil. Again, part of the problem with Elihu, I think, just like the problem is with Job, friends, is they hold to a biblical principle, they just make misapplication of it, and to the things that were temporal and going on at that point in time. And the reality is, sometimes bad things happen to good people, and sometimes good things happen to bad people, and neither one's a reflection of their character. 6 and 7, not 6 and 7, verse 8. And if they are bound in fetters, held in the cords of affliction, then he tells them their work and their transgressions, that they have acted defiantly. This seems to be a reference, maybe even to the righteous of verse 7. And I think the point is sometimes in 8 to 10, God allows his people to face affliction. Why would he allow his people to face affliction? According to Elihu. Verse 10, what's it designed to do?
Make them listen.
It's designed to instruct them. It's designed to teach them something. And so sometimes God allows affliction because it teaches. Sometimes God allows affliction to turn us from what? Iniquity. Is that true? It is true. The chastening of the Lord. Talked about in Hebrews chapter. What about the thorn in the flesh of Paul? Whatever that was, it was an affliction. What was it designed to do? To keep him humble. It was designed to teach him something. So, does God sometimes use affliction to teach? Yes, he can. I think here's the problem, by the way, with Elihu and the three friends is this, and this is where we have to be careful trying to speak from God. Can God use affliction to instruct us, to chasten us? The answer is yes. Is all suffering the chastening of the Lord? No. No. Sometimes the book of Ecclesiastes, there's time and chance that can happen to all men. And sometimes in our limited human wisdom, we can't always know. Sometimes we say like, perhaps, or who knows. Now, in all those circumstances, there's something I can learn. I think the book of Ecclesiastes points that out. But we have to be careful, always speaking on behalf of God. And that's what Elihu and his friends do. For example, what if, somebody has a heart attack and I go up, and I sit down next to Wade in the emergency room and I say, listen, God's trying to teach you something. I don't know what you've done, but you need to learn something. You need to determine. Is that a logical conclusion? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. So here's my point. Are they correct that God can use chastening to instruct? Yes, but it's a jump to say that all suffering is what? The direct chastening of the Lord. But Elihu says he allows affliction. It's designed to instruct them. How do we react to the instruction? Well, sometimes what happens is they reject it and resent it and they turn away from God and they die in youth and their life ends among the perverted persons. But if you were righteous, you would open your ears in verse 15 and you would be delivered. And the implication seems to be all of this Job has been happening to you. This is God chastening you. Was that true? No. Go back to chapter 1. That's not what happened at all with Satan coming into the presence of the Lord. But he said, Job, if you'd been righteous, you would have listened. And if you'd have listened, we wouldn't be talking right now because all your riches would what? Would have returned to you. And you would have been blessed. And so, listen, indeed, if you had brought out of the dire distress into a broad place where there's no restraint, and what is set on your table would be full of richness, but you are filled with the judgment due to the wicked. Judgment and justice take hold of you because there is wrath. Beware, he take you away with one blow for a large ransom, which would not help you avoid it. Will your riches or the mighty forces keep you from distress? Do not desire the night when people are cut off in their place. Take heed. Do not turn to iniquity, for you've chosen this rather than affliction. In other words, the point again, if you had listened, then you wouldn't be in the situation right now. Now, 22. Let me get over here to verse. Let me go back to verse 11 and 12 because I skipped over that and how it was outlined here. Look at verse 11 and 12. If you obey and serve him, they spend their days in prosperity and their years in pleasure. If they don't obey, they'll perish by the sword and they die without knowledge. In some ways, Elihu seems to be right back where the friends were. You serve God, you prosper. You don't serve God, you don't prosper, seems to be the thought there. Verse 22, God is exalted by his power. He has all power. In fact, who's going to tell God he did wrong? Who's going to assign to him wrong? The Bible points out over in Romans chapter 11, who's become God's counselor? Sometimes, we realize we can't tell God what to do. Sometimes we want to tell God what to do or question the Lord. Why this? Why did it happen this way? Elihu's point is, who can really question the Lord? God knows more than we know. He's wiser than we are. And therefore, who can tell to God, you've done wrong? That's not how you should have handled that. That's not how you should have answered that prayer. That's not how you should have responded in that circumstance. It reminds me in Acts chapter 11, Peter came back after having converted the household of Cornelius. And when he got back in Acts 11, the Jews there were just chomping at the bit to get at him and say, you've gone into uncircumcised men and you've eaten. And so Peter relates everything that had happened, how the Holy Spirit fell upon them. But he ends it by saying, and who was I that I could withstand God? And the point is, who was I to stand in God's way? In other words, Peter's point is, if that's what God wanted to do, who was I to tell God, no, Lord, you can't do that. That's not right, that's not wrong. And of course, we can't do that. Although sometimes people want to act that way, whether it comes to God's laws or other. Well, that's not fair, that's not right, it shouldn't be that way. In essence, what they're doing is they're telling them, I'm smarter than what you are. And what Elihu says is, God's subject to no one. You can't tell God what to do. And man admires him because of his work. Then he turns in 26 through the remainder of this section here to talk about God's greatness as seen in nature. God is great, and we do not know him, nor can the number of his years be discovered. And he goes through and he talks about the evidence of God's greatness. And it's not, again, unlike what God himself does. For example, the water cycle in 27 and 28. It may rain, storm maybe later on this afternoon. We get rain. How does it work? Well, he draws up drops of water which distill as rain from the mist, and the clouds drop down and pour abundantly on man. Now, it's a very simplistic explanation of the water cycle, but the point I think that Elihu is making is, who put that in place? God does. God did. And it works by his command and his power. You think about the storms. Who could understand the spreading of the clouds and the thunder from his canopy? The sky is his canopy. And he mentions again the thunder down in verse 32. Covers his hands with lightning. He commands it to strike. His thunder declares it. The cattle also concerning the rising storm. You think about the thunder, and the lightning and the power behind that. Who controls all that? Well, the lightning is in his hand. More than one verse throughout the Old Testament describes the voice of God like thunder. But here I think he's talking about literally about the thunder. And that speaks to God's power. He's the one that's in control of it. So he controls the thunder and the lightning. That really goes over into chapter 37. He said in verse 1, and this also my heart trembles and leaps from its place. You ever heard thunder and it causes you to heart skip a beat when you hear it? But hear attentively the thunder of his voice and the rumbling that comes from his mouth. He sends it forth under the whole heaven, and his lightning to the ends of the earth. After it a voice roars. He thunders with a majestic voice, and he does not restrain them when his voice is heard. God thunders marvelously with his voice. He does great things that we cannot comprehend. And so he seems to be talking about the thunder and the lightning, and God's work is something that man doesn't fully comprehend. Look at verse 30, going back to the previous chapter. He scatters his light upon it, maybe his lightning covers the depths of the sea. A couple of different ways that's taken. Some believe that he's saying he's the one that covers the depths of the sea with the water. Others take it to be he scatters light upon the depths of the sea. If that's the case, it may just be simply emphasizing God's power. That my understanding is light only goes so far down in the ocean, and then beyond that it's dark. But you know where God can see? He sees everywhere. Psalm 139 talks about if we could go to the depths of the sea, even right there you could see me. You're there. That's the power. That is the power of God. Look at verse 31. For by these things he judges the people and gives food in abundance. Where does our food come from? God. We think about, it's getting to that time of year. Brother Ross probably getting ready to plant something if he hadn't already. And there are some things beyond our control, right? You plant the seed and then you have to wait what? For the rain. Now you can water it. Guess where that water came from? It came from the rain, which was provided by God. The point is, all of that, from the planting of the seed to its germination, to the rain, to the sun, all of that is necessary that ultimately in the end, we get the tomatoes or we get the squash, whatever it is we're planting, we get that abundance of food. Who gave it to us? God did. God put all of that into place, and that speaks to the power of God. He causes the snow and the rain and the clouds and the ice and the wind. Sometimes weather frustrates us. I mean, whether it's a snowstorm or whether it's the ice that comes, or whether it is the wind, or even tornadic winds that blow. But one thing we should always see when we look out and we see all of that is it speaks to what? God's power. He's the one that controlled all of that and brought all of that to pass. And so 19 to 23, man cannot approach such a majestic God. Teach us what we should say to him. For we can prepare nothing because of the darkness. So should he be told what I wish to speak? If a man were to speak, surely he would be swallowed up. The point is, and again, not unlike what God is going to tell Job, do you see the power of God? Do you really think a God that is that powerful, we need to point our finger at him and say what? You don't know what you're doing. You shouldn't do it that way. That's why, by the way, when God, in his defense of himself, and we'll talk about this next week, in Job 38 to 39, when he finally talks to Job, when God finally says, all right, Job, I'm going to talk to you. You've been wanting to hear, sit there and listen to me. God doesn't say one word about Satan. He doesn't say one word about the challenge in chapter 1. He doesn't explain anything. The only thing God tells Job is, Job, look around. Do you know who I am? Do you know the power that I have? Do you really think you know more than I do? And Job at the end says, you know what? I'm going to shut up, and I'm going to trust you. The point of the book of Job, again, as we've emphasized before, and it's already being hinted at here, is not an answer to why men suffer. The point of the book of Job is when we suffer, we've got to put our faith and trust unwaveringly in God, because God knows what he's doing. And that's the point. How could one tell a God like that and give instruction to him? Therefore, look at verse 34, men fear him, and he shows no partiality to any who are wise in heart. So, Elihu gives this beautiful defense of the Lord. By the way, while I'm not in agreement with any of the people that have spoken this, I couldn't agree with Job and everything Job has said. I can't agree with everything the friends said. If I had to come down on a side of the one that's closer and the one that says things that are more true, it's probably going to be Elihu. Taking his arrogance and the attitude out of it. So let's stop right there. We're going to talk about 38 through the rest of the book next week. But what do we learn here, practically speaking, from what Elihu has to say to Job? What do we say in terms of warnings to us? What do we hear in terms of instruction? What do you learn? Okay, trust God. God's mighty. God's powerful. We need to learn to trust in him. What else do we learn?
We talked about Elihu said that if you were really righteous, then your tail will be full of riches again, he will restore you.
Yeah.
But in time we see that happens. We see that he
Yeah.
restores him, and he restores him double for what
He does.
So our patience is not the patience of God. And
Yeah.
we need to, what you said earlier, just be more patient
Wait.
in times of trial and tribulation.
Yeah. Job comes out. We see the unintended by the Lord, as James chapter 5 would say. By the way, the friends that spoke, all had alluded to the fact if you'd repent, everything would come back. They had no way of knowing that. Now, that's what happens in the end, but they didn't have any way of knowing it. And that brings me out, to a lesson we have emphasized before, and I think we have to be very careful speaking for the Lord. And I think all of the friends do that at times, and Elihu does that at times. I heard a preacher one time, I probably told this before, but I was preaching in Alabama, and we went to a gospel meeting, and it was me and this preacher that was in a meeting with us, and the preacher got up there, and it was flooding in Louisiana, if I remember correctly, and he went on and on about how God had sent those floods on Louisiana because they had passed a law outlawing corporal punishment in schools. Well, could God do that? Well, no doubt he could, but how did he know that? How did he know that? My point is, when we start venturing into speaking where we don't have knowledge, we're going to end up backing ourselves into a corner. Sometimes the most we can say, when it comes to the providence of God and things that God has done, I go back to two books. The book of Philemon is one. When Onesimus had left and gone and heard the gospel and was being sent back to Philemon, you know what the Apostle Paul said? Paul said, perhaps you lost him for a little while. Even the Apostle Paul didn't say, you know what, I know exactly why all this happened. He said what? Perhaps. Mordecai in the book of Esther said, who knows but that you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Does that mean I don't learn the lessons? No, it doesn't. But be careful speaking definitively for the Lord about why things have happened and imputing to him a motive that you don't know about. Elihu does that. And it wasn't right. God wasn't chastening Job in any way. It was a challenge of Satan that Job had taken up. So be careful in speaking for the Lord. I tell you, another lesson you learn in Elihu, and I think this is important, is be careful with the attitude that you've got the market on wisdom cornered. Because when we have that attitude, you ever known somebody with that attitude? They've got the market on wisdom covered. They've got all of the answers. I will say this, by the way, a lot of times, Elihu, I don't know how old he was younger than the rest of them. A lot of times that does characterize us in our youth. Sometimes we're smarter in our youth than we are when we get older. And I'm saying that in our perception, in our way of thinking, we think we've got it all figured out. When we have that attitude, we're not willing then to do what? To listen. And when you start something by saying, listen, somebody knows what they're talking about. I've got wisdom. You listen to me. You hear what I have to say. And the answer is, Elihu is acting like he had the final word. And guess what? He didn't. Who had the final word? God did. God always has the final word. Beware trying to speak for the Lord. Be sure that the biblical principles that we hold or that we believe are correctly applied. Again, as I come back, reaping what you sow. Is that true? Yes. Does it apply always temporally? No. It doesn't always happen temporally. Same thing about the chastening of the Lord. Any other questions or comments that one has in terms of what we learned in Elihu's speech this morning?
So we should react to things, whether we think they're from God or
The wise man Solomon observed that God appointed the day of good and the day of adversity. So in the day of good, rejoice. In the day of adversity, consider. When things happen, I think there's always a time for consideration and lessons and what can I learn from this. I think that's different than saying always imputing it as a direct action of the Lord or the direct chastening of the Lord. We'll pick up there. We're going to finish this next week, and then we'll get into the book of Ecclesiastes in our study.